Just a temp. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before a Black Hawk helicopter landed on his hospital roof carrying for Marines who would destroy everything he built. The supply closet at Seattle General in San Diego smells of latex and industrial disinfectant, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like caged wasps. Rachel Torres folds gauze with mechanical precision, each corner aligned perfectly, her hands moving through the task with the kind of efficiency that comes from having performed the same motion 10,000 times. Her scrubs hang loose on a frame that once carried 200 pounds of tactical gear through the streets of Fallujah, and when she reaches into her pocket during her break, her fingers find the tarnished challenge coin she's carried for 3 years, its edges worn smooth from constant handling, its military insignia catching the harsh fluorescent light. She turns it over once. Twice. Then slides it back into her scrub pocket where no one thinks to look. The challenge coin is the only thing from before that she still owns. The government decided Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres officially died in a bureaucratic grave somewhere between an extraction order and a classified after-action report, so now she is just Rachel, the temp nurse with impeccable technique but no verifiable employment history before 18 months ago. She moves through the corridors of Seattle General like smoke, invisible to doctors who bark orders without looking at her face, competent enough that patients request her by name but careful never to exceed what a temporary nursing contract should know. The surgical wing gleams with cold steel and the rhythmic beep of cardiac monitors, and when she checks the assignment board on Tuesday morning, she sees room for 47, Captain James Vega, post-surgical observation, stable condition. The name means nothing to her until she reads the surgical notes, artillery specialist, 3rd Fleet Amphibious Task Force, and then muscle memory stirs in her chest, a ghost of recognition she forces back down. Dr. Whitfield arrives for morning rounds in Italian loafers that cost more than her monthly salary, his eyes narrowing when he sees her reviewing a Medisupply invoice in the supply closet. Not reviewing, actually. Questioning. She is standing there with the invoice in one hand and a price sheet in the other, her jaw set at that specific angle that means she has found something that does not add up. That's not your job, Whitfield says, his voice carrying the kind of arrogance that only comes from never being told no by anyone who matters. Rachel does not look up. Arthroscopic equipment. Listed at $8,400 per unit. Market rate is $2,100. She sets the invoice down with the care of someone placing evidence. This has been ordered 17 times in the last 4 months. Whitfield steps closer, his cologne arriving before his body does, something expensive and aggressive. He reaches past her and pulls the invoice from the counter, scanning it with the kind of speed that suggests he is not actually reading it. Hospital procurement handles vendor relationships, he says flatly. Your job is gauze and bedpans. Rachel's jaw tightens fractionally. The only concession to rage she allows. Her hands are steady as she begins folding a fresh stack of 4x4 gauze squares, her movements precise and methodical. 12 folds. 23 seconds per stack. She does not respond to him. Does not look at him. Just works. But Whitfield sees what he needs to see. He sees an obstacle. He sees someone who asks questions instead of following orders, who notices discrepancies instead of closing her eyes, who has apparently spent enough time in medical settings to understand that $25,600 worth of unnecessary equipment orders in 4 months might interest people like hospital auditors or insurance investigators. He calculates the threat to his arrangement with Medisupply Corp., the same arrangement that has been paying for his lake house in Escondido for the past 6 years, a modest but beautiful place with a dock and a boat registered to an LLC that exists in Delaware. Rachel Torres is a problem. And Dr. Whitfield has learned over 2 decades of medicine that problems have solutions. The cafeteria at Seattle General is loud during the lunch shift, a collision of voices and the metallic scrape of trays. Rachel stands in line with her lunch tray, turkey sandwich, apple, water, when Whitfield enters from the opposite direction. She does not see him approach. Does not see the calculation in his eyes. What she sees is the world tilting sideways as his hip bumps her tray with the kind of force that looks accidental if anyone is watching, which several nurses are, which is the entire point. Her lunch spills across the tile floor in a spreading pattern of broken ceramic and scattered turkey slices. Oh, clumsy, Whitfield says, not turning around, his voice pitched to carry to the resident standing 3 tables over. You'd think after 18 months you'd have your footing. Rachel kneels to gather the broken pieces. A food service worker appears with a mop, his expression carefully neutral. She stands and walks to the trash bin, her movements controlled and precise, the same steadiness that once kept her breathing through a sandstorm for 16 hours while sniper rounds snapped past her head. Whitfield is already sitting with the 2 residents, Morrison and Chen, both third-year residents who understand exactly who controls their recommendations. He sets down his coffee with the same precision Rachel uses to fold gauze. I'll make you a bet, Whitfield says, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. $500 she quits within a week. Temps can't handle real medicine. The pressure breaks them. Morrison glances toward Rachel, then back to Whitfield. She looks solid to me. Solid. Whitfield laughs, a sound like ice cracking. She's a placeholder. This job requires surgeons and residents, not people who pick things up off the floor for a living. He takes a sip of his coffee. Week and a half, she's gone. Who wants in? Chen does not meet Rachel's eyes. But she does, eventually, walk to a different table to sit alone with a new lunch someone else bought her from the gift shop. The challenge coin in her pocket feels heavier than it should. The rest of her shift passes in the careful rhythm of vital checks and medication administration, the work that fills the hours between dawn and dusk. Rachel moves through the hospital with the kind of invisibility that comes from being underestimated, from being seen as a temp who will not last, from being the kind of person that people like Whitfield calculate as irrelevant. She checks blood pressures with a cuff that hisses softly as it deflates, she adjusts for drips and watches the fluid climb steady in the chambers, she marks her observations in charts with the kind of precision that comes from training where mistakes cost lives instead of just jobs. At 2:19 in the afternoon, she enters room for 47. Captain James Vega lies in the bed with the patient in him sleeping, his left forearm positioned at his side where the bandages from his surgical reconstruction are just beginning to show the first pale hints of healing. There is a tattoo on his left forearm that she does not allow herself to look at directly. But she sees it anyway, her name, inked there in 2009, on the day she carried him bleeding through a kill zone in Fallujah while a city burned around her and he kept saying her call sign like a prayer. Reaper 7. Keep moving. Keep breathing. Get us out. She checks his blood pressure, 118/72. Acceptable. His heart rate, 68. Steady. His oxygen saturation, 96% on room air, which is good, which is exactly what a post-surgical patient should look like. The morphine drip is running cleanly, and his eyes remain closed beneath the thin gauze of sedation, his breathing deep and regular as a man sleeping off something smaller than guilt. She does not touch his arm where the tattoo is. She does not allow her hands to remember what they once held. She documents his vitals in the chart with the kind of care she gives to every patient, every number recorded with the precision of someone who understands that these numbers are the difference between someone's mother visiting them at home and someone's mother visiting them in a cemetery. His eyes flicker open just as she is finishing her notations. His pupils are still wide from the medication, but conscious. Aware. He looks at her with the kind of confusion that suggests his brain is processing information through several layers of pharmaceutical haze, but not recognizing her. Of course he does not recognize her. That was the entire point of disappearing. That was the purpose of becoming invisible. Everything's stable, Captain, she says quietly, keeping her voice in that deferential register that a temp nurse uses with doctors and officers. You're doing fine. He blinks at her, his expression softening back into sleep without ever quite reaching acknowledgement. She finishes her notes and turns to leave, the challenge coin pressing against her sternum like a weight that time has not managed to lighten. But that was not the worst part. That was just the moment before everything accelerated, the moment before the decisions that had kept her hidden for 3 years would be forced out into the light by a man whose arrogance would prove to be catastrophically smaller than his desperation. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. The chart hit the floor at 3:20 p.m., papers scattering like wounded birds across the tile of the nursing station. Dr. Whitfield's hand was still extended from the throw, his fingers curled as if the violence of the gesture had satisfied something deep in his chest. For nurses froze mid-task. 2 residents stopped talking. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of a man who'd learned that public humiliation was more effective than any private reprimand. "Or can't you read?" Rachel looked down at the scattered pages, Captain Vega's post-operative vitals, anticoagulant protocols, surgical notes bleeding across the linoleum in disorganized chaos. She could feel their eyes on her. Nurse Andra. Dr. Chen. Dr. Patel. The 2 residents whose names she hadn't yet learned. All waiting to see if she would break, if the fracture in her composure would finally spiderweb into visible damage. She knelt without a word. "Oh wait, I forgot," Whitfield continued, his voice pitched for the room rather than for her. "They probably didn't cover chart organization in whatever online diploma mill you attended. Maybe if you spent less time questioning my supply orders and more time learning basic nursing protocols, you'd understand why real hospitals don't hire temps for critical care." Rachel's hands moved with mechanical precision, gathering each sheet in order. Vital signs first. Then labs. Then surgical notes. The papers were cool and slightly tacky with humidity from the hospital's aging climate control system. Her jaw had tightened fractionally, the only visible concession to the rage moving through her like current through copper wire, but her breathing remained steady, controlled, the way it had been the last time she'd knelt in a foreign city, bleeding herself dry while holding someone else's life together. She stood. The stack of pages was perfectly reassembled now, the chart complete and organized. She walked to the chart slot at the nursing station and slid it home with precision, the cardboard edge catching for half a second before settling into place with a soft metallic clink. Then she turned and met Whitfield's eyes. 2 seconds. That was all she allowed. 2 seconds of a gaze that had once made enemy combatants reassess their tactical positions, a look that carried the weight of decisions made at distances of 800 meters, of choices that had kept 17 people breathing when the mathematics said they should have stopped. 2 seconds of something in her eyes that made the room's air pressure shift subtly, as if the fluorescent lights themselves were holding their breath. Whitfield's satisfaction faltered. Just for a moment. Just a flicker, like a bulb losing power for one inconsistent beat before stabilizing again. Then Rachel turned and walked back to her rounds, her movements precise and economical, each step a small statement in a language the room was beginning to understand without words. She had 6 patient rooms to check before the end of her shift. 3 for drips to adjust. 1 dressing change on the surgical wound in room for 41. The elderly man in room for 38 needed his pain medication in 47 minutes, and she would be there, on schedule, her hand steady as surgical lasers. The nurses returned to their charting. The residents resumed their conversation, voices slightly lower than before. Dr. Patel made a note in a patient file. Everything returned to the surface appearance of normal. But something had shifted. The room felt different. The way air feels different after lightning strikes nearby, charged with a kind of potential that everyone can sense even if they can't articulate it. Rachel entered room for 47 at 3:34 p.m., the scheduled time for Captain Vega's vital signs check. He was sleeping, his breathing steady, his left arm positioned above the blanket in a way that exposed the forearm where her name was inked in military lettering, permanent, unavoidable, a statement of something that couldn't be erased no matter how much time or distance separated them. Rachel's hands didn't shake as she reached for his blood pressure cuff. They never shook. That was the thing about training your nervous system to function while mortars landed within 20 meters, civilian stress lost its capacity to make you visibly tremble. His blood pressure was elevated. 158/94. The post-operative protocol should have been bringing him down by now, should have had him calm and pain-managed and stabilized for the recovery phase. Rachel checked the 4-line, traced the anticoagulant drip, and found herself staring at Whitfield's dosing orders with the part of her brain that never really left the medical field, the part that had kept 2 bleeding Marines alive in a Fallujah basement for 16 hours using nothing but gauze, compression, and the muscle memory of field trauma surgery. The dosing was aggressive. Too aggressive for a patient with Vega's profile, for someone with his particular injury pattern and his blood loss history. It was the kind of approach that looked defensible on paper, the kind of call that a chief of surgery could justify in front of a board, but it created unnecessary risk, the kind of risk that turned recoverable patients into complications. She made another note in the chart. His heart rate was elevated to 104 beats per minute. The monitors at the nursing station would be showing the same data, but she had learned not to flag concerns that weren't her official purview. A temp nurse questioning a chief of surgery's protocol was a temp nurse planning her exit interview. She adjusted his pillows, checked his oxygen saturation, 92%, acceptable but not ideal, and made a decision that would ultimately cost her everything. She walked back to the nursing station and paged the cardiology team directly, bypassing the established chain of command, her hand steady as she punched the numbers into the phone. Dr. Whitfield called back at 4:03 p.m. His voice came through the phone like a tank engine idling in a garage, low, powerful, dangerous. "You paged cardiology? Over my protocol." "His vitals are trending downward," Rachel said, her voice stripped to its most basic components. "Elevated heart rate. Elevated blood pressure. I'm concerned about the anticoagulant dosing. Let me explain something about the chain of command, sweetheart. You check vitals. You empty bedpans. You do not question my medical decisions. Especially not to cardiology. You go through me. You get authorization from me. You don't just pick up a phone and contradict my treatment plan because you think you know something." He reversed the cardiology consultation with a single phone call while Rachel listened, her challenge coin pressed between her thumb and forefinger in her pocket, the tarnished military coin stamped with her unit insignia, worn smooth by 17 years of operations and the 3 years since she'd officially stopped existing. The coin had come from a fellow Master Chief in Fallujah, forged from aluminum and shrapnel and the understanding that some debts could never be fully repaid. "I'm going on break," Rachel said quietly, and hung up the phone before he could respond, her tone conveying something that made Nurse Sandra look up from her charting with an expression somewhere between concern and awe. Captain Vega's monitors continued their irregular patterns throughout the evening. Rachel checked on him at 6:15 p.m., and his left forearm was visible again, the tattoo catching the soft light from the bedside lamp. She had carried him through 4 kilometers of urban warfare. She had held his bleeding together while bullets came from 3 different angles. She had whispered things to him in the darkness that no one else was authorized to hear. And now he slept without recognition, morphine fogging the synapses that might have remembered, time and distance and the simple cruelty of circumstance conspiring to keep them separated even as they occupied adjacent realities in the same hospital. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the knowledge building in her chest like pressure behind a dam, the knowledge that Dr. Whitfield had ordered something medically reckless, that he had chosen his convenience over patient safety, and that she was positioned precisely where she could do something about it if she was willing to break the one rule that had kept her hidden for 3 years: don't draw attention. Don't prove who you actually are. Don't let the world see the warrior underneath the scrubs. The hospital settled into its night rhythm. Fluorescent lights hummed. Monitors beat their steady electronic songs. Somewhere down the corridor, a patient called for water. And Rachel Torres, Master Chief Petty Officer, sat in the medication room at 11:43 p.m. and stared at the morphine vials arrayed before her, her hands pausing for just a moment on the cool glass, her face betraying nothing while the challenge coin pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat, like an old weapon waiting to be drawn, like the memory of a woman she'd buried 3 years ago and thought would stay dead. She was about to find out how wrong she'd been. The call came at 2:44 a.m. Room 447's cardiac monitor screamed in the dead hours, the rhythm dissolving from sinus into something jagged and wrong. Rachel heard it from the medication room 3 floors down, that specific timbre of alarm that lives in muscle memory, the sound that had once meant incoming fire and bodies needing hands. She was moving before conscious thought caught up, the morphine vials forgotten on the counter, her scrubs already in motion toward the stairs because elevators were for people who weren't listening to what the machines were saying. The monitor showed atrial fibrillation with a rapid ventricular response. Rate climbing past 160. blood pressure dropping in real time on the telemetry display, not crashing yet, but the trajectory was a written sentence: Captain James Vega was deteriorating. Rachel's mind catalogued what she already knew. Vega was 72 hours post-op from a routine gallbladder resection, the kind of surgery that should have landed him back at his fleet office by Tuesday, ordering cargo movements and signing operational reports. Instead, his chest was telling a different story, and that story had Dr. Whitfield's signature written through every page of it. The anticoagulation protocol. Of course. The excessive dosing she'd flagged 3 times in the medication orders, dosing that made no sense for a straightforward surgical recovery, dosing that Whitfield had overridden with a single dismissive note: "I'm the surgeon here, Torres." Not Ms. Torres. Not Nurse Torres. Just the name, delivered like an insult. She'd said nothing then, had simply documented her concern in the notes with the precision of someone who knew that someday, somewhere, someone would ask why the doses had been so aggressive, why the warfarin had been pushed to levels that risked spontaneous bleeding into tissue spaces where bleeding could kill you just as dead as sepsis. That day was arriving now. At 2:33 a.m. on a Monday, with monitor alarms singing their warning song and the code team still 3 floors away handling a diabetic patient's hypoglycemic seizure in the ICU. Rachel hit the 4th floor landing running, taking the steps 2 at a time with the kind of efficiency that came from 16 years of moving through combat zones in full kit and body armor. Now she wore scrubs that felt like nothing, moved like a ghost through hallways lit by the surgical glow of emergency panels. The stairwell door burst open into the cardiology wing and she was moving past the nurse station before Chen could even register her presence. Room for 47. Vega's room. The room where she'd been taking his vitals for 18 months while he slept with her name inked on his forearm and no recognition in his eyes. The monitors were visible from the corridor. The rhythm had deteriorated further, the jagged lines of VTAC now competing with moments of near flatline. His blood pressure had dropped to 58/32. Pericardial fluid was accumulating behind his heart, pressing down on it like a slow-motion fist, and the anticoagulation was making sure that fluid was entirely blood. Tamponade. The word arrived like diagnosis. His own body was drowning his heart. 2 resident physicians stood at the monitor bank outside the room, staring at the screens with the particular frozen expression of people trained to act but uncertain which protocol applied when the protocol itself had created the emergency. One of them, Rodriguez, one of the residents who'd heard Whitfield's crude joke about Rachel's competence, turned to her with the look of someone who'd suddenly remembered the lifeguard wasn't on duty. His rhythm's falling apart, Rodriguez said. Not a question. A problem stated and immediately passed. Rachel was already moving past him, already pulling the crash cart to the doorway, already assessing the room's geometry the way her hands had assessed 1,000 other rooms. Where was the door to the corridor? Where was the light? Where was the clear space to work if this became what it was becoming? Get the attending, Rachel said. Short. Direct. The voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Tell him Captain Vega's building tamponade and we're running out of time. Rodriguez blinked. We should wait for the code team, they're just coming up from. They're 90 seconds away minimum. His heart won't wait 90 seconds. The clarity in her voice stopped him mid-thought. There was no question in what she'd said, no deference to hierarchy or protocol. She wasn't asking. She was a woman who'd seen this before, in a burnt-out Humvee with sand in her teeth and a Marine bleeding into his thoracic cavity, and she knew exactly how much time they had because she'd learned it in a place where the equation was always measured in seconds and the remainder was measured in body bags. She was in the room now. Vega's chest rose and fell with the ventilator's mechanical rhythm, his eyes closed, unaware that the woman standing over him had once dragged him for kilometers through a kill zone while his blood soaked her uniform and her will kept him alive through sheer stubborn refusal to let the mathematics of his injuries equal death. His neck veins were distended. Textbook finding. The pericardial fluid pressing against his right atrium, making it impossible for blood to fill his heart, making every pump less effective until the pump stopped working entirely. Rachel's hands moved to the crash cart, pulling the defibrillator pads aside to access the equipment beneath. A 16-gauge angiocath needle. A syringe. The kind of improvised pericardial tap that belonged to a field hospital in Fallujah, not to a civilian ICU in San Diego, but the mathematics of trauma were the same everywhere. Remove the fluid. Release the pressure. Let the heart beat again. The monitor alarm intensified. VTAC. Full ventricular fibrillation now. The heart wasn't beating, it was just vibrating, just creating the appearance of activity while actual blood flow became something approaching zero. 45 seconds. That was the window before brain damage started, the point where the hypoxia shifted from survivable to life-altering. 45 seconds before Vega stopped being a man and started being a vegetable in an intensive care bed, breathing through a tube while machines made his chest rise and fall and his mind floated somewhere dark and unreachable. Whitfield burst into the room at precisely the moment Rachel was reaching for the adhesive pads to mark the injection site. He was still buttoning his shirt, had clearly been called from sleep, and he moved with the automatic authority of a man who had never seriously considered being questioned in his own surgical domain. Standard ACLS protocol, Whitfield commanded, his voice already moving into the specific timbre of a doctor giving orders. Start compressions, push epi, prepare for defibrillation. Get the intern on his chest now. Rachel didn't move. Her hands remained steady, her eyes tracking the monitor rhythm, her mind processing the information the way a machine processes code. Compressions. Epinephrine. Defibrillation. All standard procedures. All completely useless for a heart that was drowning in its own fluid, all solutions that addressed the rhythm while ignoring the actual problem. His pericardium's filling, Rachel said. Not loud. Not questioning. Simply stating the fact the way someone states that the sun is rising. Compressions won't restart a heart that's being compressed from outside. Whitfield's head turned toward her with the specific quality of a man hearing insubordination. I'm aware of the cardiac physiology, nurse. We follow protocol. Your protocol killed him, Rachel said. The words hung in the room like something physical. Rodriguez sucked in a breath. The intern, a nervous third year named Patterson, froze mid-reach toward the code cart. Whitfield's face changed color, shifted from pale to something approaching magenta. You do not speak to me that way. You are a temporary contractor with no authority to. The monitor flat-lined. Full asystole. The sound it made was the sound of a heartbeat becoming absence, the sound of a man turning into a problem to be solved rather than a person to be saved. Rachel was already moving, was already reaching for the instruments because some decisions make themselves, because some moments reach down into your bones and grab the muscle memory that no amount of civilian time can wash away. Her hands found the scalpel, a surgical blade from the sterile tray because that was faster than anything else, faster than waiting for equipment, faster than protocol, faster than the 30 seconds her brain calculated as the absolute limit before the cells in Captain Vega's brain began their irreversible collapse. The skin incision came first. A line from the xiphoid process down toward his left side, the anatomy map alive in her fingertips even after 3 years of pretending to be someone else. 2 ribs. That was the window. The 4th and 5th intercostal space. The place where the heart lived behind its cage of bone and she could reach it, could feel it, could stop it from suffocating in its own fluid. Whitfield's voice behind her became something incoherent. Protest. Disbelief. The sound of a man watching his authority disappear like smoke. Rachel didn't hear it. She was already through the second layer of tissue, the ribs spreading with a specific kind of gentle force that came from understanding that bone was fragile if you went the wrong direction, and she was already there, already pushing her gloved hand into the space where his pericardium waited, already finding the fluid, warm blood under her fingertips, the specific texture of the body doing exactly what she predicted. She found the pericardium. Not a vein. Not an artery. The fibrous sac surrounding the heart itself. Her fingers were steady as surgical instruments. The knife moved precisely. The incision opened the sac and the blood poured out, maybe a liter of it, maybe more. the accumulation of Whitfield's aggressive anticoagulation turning into a flow that made the room smell like copper and salt and the specific scent of blood that's been trapped inside the human body too long. The heart. Suddenly visible. Suddenly free. The monitor still flat but the muscle right there in her hand, and Rachel Torres, Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, the woman who'd been buried in bureaucratic graves and classified files 3 years ago, began direct cardiac massage with her bare hand against the heart that belonged to the man she'd once saved and then spent 18 months trying to forget. The heart monitor's flatline scream cut through room for 47 like an air raid siren at 4:33 a.m. One continuous wail. No rhythm. No chance. Captain James Vega's chest stopped moving beneath the surgical drapes, not the slow decline of natural cardiac arrest, but the sudden mechanical silence of pericardial tamponade, fluid crushing his heart into uselessness because Dr. Whitfield's anticoagulation protocol had been written by a man more concerned with billing codes than physiology. The code team was for minutes out. Minimum. Rachel moved before her brain caught up with her hands. She didn't reach for the phone. Didn't call for help. Didn't follow the protocol that would have left Captain Vega brain dead on a ventilator by the time resuscitation arrived. Instead, she grabbed the scalpel from the instrument tray, 14-gauge steel, weight of a ballpoint pen, weight of everything she'd spent 18 months trying to bury. The 3 residents who'd rushed in with a crash cart froze in the doorway, their eyes wide with the particular shock of watching someone violate every teaching they'd internalized about chain of command and proper procedure. Dr. Chen opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Their textbooks had covered emergency cricothyrotomy, emergency needle decompression of a tension pneumothorax, but not this, not a temp nurse in wrinkled scrubs about to crack open a sternum with the kind of confidence that only came from doing it in conditions they'd never imagined. Rachel positioned the blade at the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and didn't hesitate. The incision went through skin and subcutaneous tissue with the sharp whisper of a blade finding its work. No trembling. No second-guessing. Just the muscle memory of a woman who had performed this exact procedure 11 times in sandstorms and firefights, when the choice wasn't between protocol and heresy, it was between saving a life and watching someone die because the textbook wasn't written for conditions where the nearest operating room was 50 kilometers away and the helicopter wasn't coming. Blood spilled across the drapes in arterial red. The residents made sounds like air escaping punctured lungs. Rachel's hands moved through the intercostal muscles with anatomical precision, spreading the ribs with a handheld retractor, the sternum spreading like pages of a book that had never been meant to open this way. The pericardium lay exposed beneath, distended with fluid the color of rust and regret. One quick incision. The fluid drained away like a confession she couldn't stop making. There. His heart. Compressed into uselessness. A muscle the size of a human fist, the vessel that had kept him alive through Fallujah when she'd carried him bleeding through a kill zone, and now it wasn't beating at all. Rachel's right hand slipped into the chest cavity, not how anatomy textbooks showed it, but how field surgeons did it when sterile technique was a luxury they couldn't afford. Her fingers found the heart and began the rhythmic compression that mimicked natural cardiac motion, pushing blood through coronary arteries that had been starved for 2 minutes and 47 seconds. Compress. Release. Compress. Release. The muscle beneath her hand began to respond, the tissue warming as blood flowed back into it, oxygenated and angry and refusing to die. 12 compressions. 15. Her palm curved around the organ like she was holding something sacred and profane at once. The residents had stopped moving. Had stopped breathing. Dr. Chen's hand covered her mouth, not in horror, but in recognition. That wasn't just emergency medicine happening in room 447. That was someone who had trained for this, who had lived through this, who had been somewhere that required this level of skill. At compression 23, the monitor converted. The flatline became a rhythm. Irregular at first, then stabilizing. The sinus rhythm climbed across the screen like a mountain climber finding solid ground. 62 beats per minute. Then 78. The heart underneath Rachel's fingers was beating again, pushing blood on its own, remembering how to live. Rachel stepped back and stripped off her gloves in 2 sharp motions. Blood soaked through her scrubs at the chest and wrists. Her breathing was controlled, but her hands told a different story, steady as a surgical laser, but belonging to someone who had just burned away every lie she'd constructed in 18 months. Dr. Whitfield erupted into the room like a man whose world had fractured in real time. His face cycled through shock, then calculation, then something darker, the look of a man watching his carefully constructed fraud scheme crack open along the same lines as Captain Vega's sternum. Because Rachel Torres had just demonstrated surgical skills that no temp nursing agency teaches. Had just shown muscle memory that could only come from combat trauma surgery. Had just performed a procedure that most surgeons only read about in journals from war hospitals in Kandahar and Baghdad. He couldn't look away from her blood-soaked hands. "What the hell do you think you just did?" His voice had lost its casual cruelty. It had become something sharper, the sound of a man watching his leverage disappear. "You are suspended effective immediately. Security will escort you out once you've cleaned up. Do not touch another patient. Do not." But his eyes kept drifting back to her chest cavity, still open, still requiring closure before the surgical team arrived. He was already calculating. Already moving past shock into damage control, the part of his brain that had survived 20 years of cost-benefit analysis, recognizing that a woman who could perform open cardiac massage with her bare hands was a threat magnitude he'd never anticipated. Rachel didn't respond. Didn't defend herself. Just pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and began closing the chest cavity with sutures that matched her incision, precise, efficient, the work of someone who had closed wounds in darkness and dust with nothing but a field kit and the certainty that the next moment might require doing this again. Within the hour, Whitfield was on the phone with his contact on the hospital board, then with the nursing agency demanding Rachel's credentials be re-verified with additional scrutiny. Then with a private investigator, a woman named Diane who asked no questions and understood that certain problems required certain solutions. By 9 a.m., Rachel was seated across from 2 men in suits in an administrator's office. They had the specific courtesy of people enforcing institutional protection, not personal malice. The credentials investigation had triggered flags, they explained. Inconsistencies in her employment history prior to 18 months ago. Background check issues that required immediate clarification. It wasn't a question. It was a procedure. Whitfield had made a single call to someone, and the machinery of institutional protection had begun rotating, smoothly and without emotion, the way machines do when they have been maintained by careful money and careful silence. She surrendered her badge. Returned to the locker room. Changed out of blood-stained scrubs into street clothes, jeans, a grey hoodie, the kind of clothes that belonged to no one in particular. The only thing she transferred between uniforms was the tarnished military challenge coin, palm-sized and stamped with her unit insignia, kept in the pocket closest to her heart because some things were heavier than metal. At 11 p.m., long after the day shift ended and the night shift had settled into its rhythm, Rachel returned through the staff entrance. The hospital laundry occupied a basement corner, fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of institutional surrender. Industrial washers hummed their mechanical song. Steam rose from the pressurized dryers like ghosts leaving the building. She found the blood-stained scrubs in the quarantine bin, the blue cotton stained with Captain Vega's life, marked for incineration because that was protocol. But Rachel pulled them free anyway, rinsed them in a utility sink, and brought them to an empty folding station. Her hands moved through the motions the way they moved through everything, with precision that required no thought. Blue fabric became careful geometric shapes. The shirt folded into thirds. The pants folded into quarters. Each motion deliberate, each crease sharp enough to cut skin. She had folded a flag this way once, over the casket of a woman whose name had been officially erased. She had folded combat uniforms in barracks at 2 in the morning after the kind of missions that never made news. She had folded a life into a shape small enough to carry. This was no different. Just blue cotton. Just the end of another identity. Just a second grave, bureaucratic this time instead of geographic, but a grave nonetheless. The challenge coin felt heavier in her pocket than it had that morning. A relic of a woman the government had decided never existed. A woman who had given 18 months to being invisible so she could heal without being asked questions she couldn't answer. A woman who had used her hands to save a life and had proven, in the act of saving him, that she was still too much herself to ever hide again. Within the hour, Dr. Whitfield's phone was already in his hand. His fingers moved with the precision of a man who had spent 15 years building leverage instead of competence. He dialed his friend on the hospital board, the one who had approved his lake house renovation loan, the one who owed him 3 favors from various discretionary decisions made in dimly lit restaurants. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. "We have a credential problem with a temp in trauma," he said, his voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "She performed a procedure she's not qualified for. I need her gone before anyone asks questions." The board member listened. The board member understood. Men like Whitfield always ensured they were understood. By 10:27 a.m., the temporary nursing agency received a formal request for credential re-verification. Not a casual inquiry. A demand. The kind that triggered automatic background checks, reference validations, and the slow machinery of bureaucratic erasure. The agency supervisor, a woman named Patricia who had been placing nurses for 19 years, felt something wrong in the tone but followed protocol anyway. She called 3 phone numbers listed as Rachel's previous employers. 2 didn't answer. 1 was a disconnected line. The system had been built carefully. The government had buried Rachel Torres's official existence so completely that even a temp agency couldn't resurrect it without triggering alarms they weren't cleared to understand. By noon, Whitfield had initiated the administrative review using an investigator he'd worked with before, a man named Michael Hayes who specialized in making problems disappear quietly, who understood how to write reports that looked official but contained only what Whitfield wanted contained. The investigator had worked on 3 previous cases for the hospital, each one resulting in a resignation, each one sealed with confidentiality agreements that ensured no legal exposure for the institution. This time would be different. This time, the investigation was triggering federal flags that no one at Seattle General even knew existed. By 2:33 p.m., Security Chief Marcus Williams, a Vietnam-era corpsman who had seen enough combat to recognize the difference between protocol and execution, knocked on Rachel's door in the break room. His face carried the weight of a man following orders he disagreed with. "You need to come with me," he said. Not a request. Not quite a command. Something in between, the way people speak when institutional machinery has already decided the outcome. Rachel stood without argument. She removed her badge. She placed her stethoscope on the table. The motion was deliberate, the kind of careful surrender that doesn't surrender anything because nothing left to lose is itself a weapon. By 4:15 p.m., she was walking through the staff entrance for the last time, a security escort at her elbow, her personal effects in a cardboard box that smelled like the cleanroom detergent they used on surgical instruments. Whitfield watched from his office window on the 3rd floor, his silhouette framed in glass, satisfied that the machinery had worked, that the revenue stream was secure, that a woman who had saved a life and broken his fraud had been removed from the equation before she could testify to anything. He didn't know that his phone call to the investigator had triggered a JSOC flag. He didn't know that accessing Rachel Torres's classified personnel file without proper clearance was itself a federal crime. He didn't know that the FBI had been monitoring Medisupply Corp's billing irregularities for 6 months, and that his panicked attempt to alter her records had connected those dots in a way that would survive any amount of institutional protection. That night, Rachel returned to the hospital laundry facility after hours. Security didn't stop her. Staff entrance, employee ID still functional until midnight, and the laundry room was empty at 9:53 p.m. on a Wednesday. She held the blue cotton scrubs that bore Captain Vega's blood, the one she'd worn when she cracked open his chest and brought his heart back to rhythm. Her hands moved with the same precision they used in Fallujah, fold at the collar, fold at the sleeves, fold the body in half, then once more, creating a perfect rectangle of hospital blue. The motion was a prayer. The motion was a funeral. She had buried Rachel Torres once, in a desert where the government decided she no longer existed. Now she was burying her again, in a laundry room in San Diego, in the clothes she'd worn for 18 months pretending to be someone less than herself. The tarnished challenge coin in her pocket, the one stamped with her unit insignia from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, the one she'd carried since Fallujah, felt heavier than it should. Challenge's coins weigh maybe 2 ounces. This one felt like gravity itself. She pulled it out and looked at the insignia. The same unit that no longer officially claimed her. The same symbol she'd carried hidden because displaying it would mean someone asked questions, and questions would mean answers, and answers would mean exposure. She pressed the coin against her palm and felt the weight of 22 years, 14 in the Navy, 8 before that in the reserves, stretching back to when she was 19 and still believed that service meant something that wouldn't later need to be buried. At 4:33 a.m., the rotor wash of a Black Hawk hit the hospital's rooftop helipad like a physical force. The sound was distinctive, that deep thudding percussion that made windows vibrate and made people in corridors instinctively straighten their spines because something authoritative had just arrived. The palm frond scattered like confetti in the turbulence. For Marines in dress blues descended the stairs into the ICU, their dress uniforms pristine, they're bearing the kind of composed intensity that made security personnel step back without being asked. Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, the lead Marine, said, not as a question but as a clarification. Operational call sign Reaper 7. We need her location immediately. The nurses at the station exchanged glances. No one had ever heard Rachel use a rank. No one had ever heard her speak about a military background. The lead nurse checked the staff directory. Room for 47, she said quietly. But she was terminated yesterday. Security Chief Marcus Williams, the Vietnam-era corpsman who had escorted Rachel out exactly 22 hours earlier, stepped forward. His posture changed. His chin lifted. Master Chief Petty Officer on deck, he announced in a voice that carried down the corridor like a rifle shot. 14 years Special Operations. Navy Cross recipient. Silver Star for Fallujah. 2 Purple Hearts. Each medal was its own sentence. Each rank was its own gravestone. She saved the patient in room for 47 yesterday morning when he went into cardiac arrest. Then we escorted her out for credential inconsistencies. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when institutions suddenly realize they have committed blasphemy against something they didn't know was sacred. Captain Vega was already rising from his bed, against explicit medical advice, against the protests of his nurses, his chest still bandaged from the emergency thoracotomy that had given him 43 more hours of life. He raised his left forearm, and the name was clearly visible, inked in the precise lettering of a combat tattoo, Rachel. Below the name, a date. The date from Fallujah. This woman carried me and 2 others for kilometers under fire, Captain Vega said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, something dangerous idling at low power. Our convoy was destroyed. She wouldn't let me die. I command a fleet today because she wouldn't let me die. He paused. The room held its breath. You fired her yesterday for saving my life. That ends now. The FBI agents entered 30 seconds later. Special Agent Rebecca Moss and Special Agent David Park, their badges catching the fluorescent lights. They were not gentle with their information. Dr. Whitfield's attempts to access and alter Master Chief Torres's personnel file yesterday triggered flags in a classified system, Moss said, her voice precise as a surgical incision. Those files are monitored at the top-secret SCI level. His modification attempts created a federal paper trail that connects directly to his billing scheme with Medisupply Corporation. Park displayed printouts. 3 years of invoices. Arthroscopic equipment listed at $47,000 that cost $12,000 wholesale. Surgical supplies marked up 300%. Consulting fees that were actually kickbacks, funneled directly into Whitfield's personal accounts, funding a lake house in Coronado and his daughter's private school tuition at Bishop's. By 2:06 p.m., exactly 43 hours after Rachel performed open cardiac massage, Dr. Whitfield was walking out of the hospital in handcuffs. They took him past the nursing station where he had thrown the chart at her feet. Nurse Sandra watched him pass. She allowed herself the smallest smile, the kind of smile that lasts one breath and contains the entire weight of vindication. the hospital board terminated his employment by 6:33 p.m. His medical license entered emergency review before his fingerprints were dry at the federal building. The FBI seized his lake house as proceeds of fraud by the following Friday. Federal prosecutors charged him with wire fraud, filing false documents, and conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud. His attorney advised him to remain silent. Whitfield could not remain silent. He spent 4 hours at the federal building explaining that he was protecting the hospital's financial interests, that Rachel was a security risk with her questions, that none of this was his fault. Every word became evidence. 2 years later, the office door on the 4th floor of Seattle General read, Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, Trauma Department Director. The nameplate was new. The rank was real. The government had decided that enough time had passed, that enough classification review had occurred, that Rachel Torres could officially exist again. The tarnished challenge coin now sat openly on her desk beside a framed photograph. Captain Vega in his full dress uniform, promoted to Brigadier General, his hand on her shoulder. Rachel in her navy dress blues, her navy cross and silver star displayed above the collar, her face finally permitted to carry the weight of what she actually was. The photograph had been taken at his promotion ceremony. For the first time in 3 years, she had stood in that uniform in public. For the first time in 3 years, she had been allowed to be herself. Nurse Sandra brought her coffee the way Rachel liked it, black, no sugar, hot enough to burn, and mentioned on a Tuesday morning that Whitfield was teaching CPR at San Diego Community College for $18 an hour. The ice in Rachel's expression didn't crack. Good, she said quietly. He can teach the compressions the right way then. Maybe he'll finally learn something about saving lives instead of ending them. That evening, Captain Vega visited during his medical follow-up, his chest bearing a thin scar that matched the trajectory of her emergency incision. They shared coffee in her office without discussing Fallujah, because some experiences exist beyond language. He left as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the palm trees that had scattered in the Black Hawk's rotor wash 2 years earlier. Rachel touched the challenge coin on her desk and spoke the words that had become her truth, the ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe. Like this video. Comment what you would have done in Rachel's position. The next segment of her story drops this week.